December 18th, 1944, the Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Gefreiter Klaus Hartmann of the 341st Volksgrenadier Division crouched in a foxhole that had become his world for the past 9 days. The temperature hovered near freezing. His uniform, designed for a short summer campaign that should have ended years ago, provided little protection against the wet cold that seeped into bones and never left. His last hot meal from the Goulash Cannoni, the beloved mobile field kitchen, had arrived 4 days earlier. Since then, he'd subsisted on his Eisern ration, the iron ration, consuming it without orders because the alternative was slow starvation. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tin of Fleischkonserve, canned meat of ambiguous origin and dubious quality, sat empty beside him. The hard bread, hartkeks, was gone. The ersatz coffee, made from roasted barley and acorns, had run out yesterday. Hartmann was a veteran of 3 years fighting, accustomed to hunger, but this was different. This was the systematic collapse of supply, the industrial strangulation of an army that could no longer feed itself in the field. Then the American artillery stopped, replaced by the distinctive sounds of infantry movement. Hartmann raised his Kar-98K rifle with fingers too numb to feel the trigger properly. The attack came swiftly. Within minutes, his position was overrun, and he found himself surrendering to soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division, who seemed impossibly well fed, impossibly equipped, impossibly abundant in everything his army lacked. The American sergeant who processed him as a prisoner spoke passable German, learned from grandparents who'd emigrated from Saxony a generation earlier. As Hartmann was led to the rear, stumbling with exhaustion and malnutrition, he passed an American supply depot. What he saw there would fundamentally alter his understanding of why Germany was losing this war. It wasn't the tanks or the aircraft or even the artillery that struck him most forcefully. It was the food, mountains of it, crates stacked higher than a man could reach, each marked with stenciled letters he couldn't read but whose meaning was unmistakable. This was abundance on a scale that seemed physically impossible, given the reality of wartime scarcity that had defined his existence since 1939. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Among those crates were tens of thousands of rectangular blue and yellow tins, each containing 12 ounces of a product that had become, in the judgment of German propaganda, a symbol of American industrial inferiority and culinary barbarism. The product was Spam, Hormel's canned pork shoulder, and it represented everything German military doctrine said shouldn't work in modern warfare. It was mass-produced rather than artisanally crafted. It required no refrigeration in an era when fresh meat signified superior logistics. It was designed for abundance rather than efficiency, wasting space and weight on packaging that seemed extravagant to armies accustomed to scarcity. Yet this derided product, mocked in German propaganda broadcasts and ridiculed by soldiers who considered themselves connoisseurs of proper military rations, had become the protein source that was feeding the largest military alliance in human history across 2 continents and 3 oceans. What Klaus Hartmann didn't know, couldn't know as he stared at those impossibly abundant supplies, was that the industrial system that produced Spam represented a fundamental difference in how America and Germany conceived of logistics, manufacturing, and the material requirements of modern industrial warfare. The story of how a maligned canned meat product became a decisive factor in World War II reveals the extent to which wars are won not just on battlefields, but in factories, supply chains, and the unglamorous infrastructure of feeding millions of men engaged in sustained combat operations across global distances. The journey of Spam from Depression-era marketing gimmick to strategic military asset began in Austin, Minnesota, population 13,000, an unlikely birthplace for anything that would affect the course of world events. George A. Hormel had founded his meatpacking company in 1891, building it through the early 20th century into a regional business that specialized in pork products. The company survived the financial panics, labor troubles, and market consolidations that destroyed many competitors. But by the mid-1930s, it faced a prosaic problem that threatened profitability: Pork shoulder, the cut between the pig's shoulder blade and front leg, had limited commercial value. Consumers preferred ham, bacon, and pork chops. The shoulders piled up in cold storage, representing capital tied up in unsold inventory that deteriorated in quality with time. George's son Jay, who'd assumed active management of the company, recognized that the solution wasn't finding better ways to sell pork shoulder as pork shoulder. The solution was transforming it into something entirely new that solved problems consumers didn't yet know they had. The problems J. Hormel identified weren't unique to his company or even to the meat industry. They were fundamental characteristics of American food distribution in an era before universal refrigeration. Fresh meat required constant refrigeration from slaughter to consumption. Distribution chains were fragile, dependent on ice houses and insulated rail cars. Spoilage rates were high. Most American families bought meat daily because they lacked adequate home refrigeration. Any disruption to this delicate system, whether from labor strikes, transportation failures, or hot weather, created immediate shortages and price spikes. J. Hormel envisioned a meat product that simply didn't care about these constraints. It would be fully cooked during canning, requiring no refrigeration thereafter. It would be shelf-stable for years rather than days. It would be convenient, requiring no preparation beyond opening the can. Most importantly, it would use the least profitable cut of pork, transforming waste into profit through industrial processing that added value rather than simply preserving existing value. The development process took several years of experimentation. The challenge wasn't cooking pork shoulder, and technique butchers had practiced for centuries. The challenge was creating a product with consistent texture, taste, and appearance that could withstand the violent environment of industrial canning. Meat shrinks as it cooks, creating empty space in cans that promotes spoilage and looks unappealing to consumers. Fat separates from lean meat during heating, creating an oily liquid that consumers found objectionable. Salt and spices distributed unevenly, resulting in bites that were bland or overwhelmingly seasoned. The Hormel Company's solution demonstrated the unglamorous engineering that underlies successful mass production. They developed a recipe that balanced 90% pork shoulder with 10% ham, adding salt, sugar, sodium nitrite as a preservative, and potato starch as a binder. The mixture was ground to a consistent texture, eliminating the chunks and variation that characterized home-cooked meat, but creating a product that processed uniformly through canning machinery. The meat was packed into rectangular cans, slightly smaller than a standard brick, a shape that maximized packing efficiency in shipping crates and storage facilities. Each can was vacuum sealed before cooking, removing air that would promote bacterial growth and oxidation. The sealed cans were cooked in pressure, retorts at temperatures exceeding 250 degrees Fahrenheit, high enough to kill all bacterial spores and fully cook the meat. During cooking, the pork released natural gelatin that filled the empty space in the can as it cooled, creating an airtight seal that preserved the contents indefinitely. The result was a product that seemed to violate basic assumptions about meat. It sat on shelves at room temperature for months without spoiling. It emerged from the can as a solid pink block that could be sliced like fresh meat or fried like bacon. It tasted, well, edible, if not exceptional. It was cheap, approximately 25 cents per can at launch, equivalent to perhaps 2 pounds of fresh pork, in an era when 2 pounds of pork was a significant portion of a working family's weekly food budget. The company needed a name that would sell this unusual product to skeptical consumers. George Hormel's original suggestion, Hormel spiced ham, was accurate but uninspiring. In 1937, Kenneth Daigneault, brother of a Hormel vice president, won a $100 naming contest, with a contraction that captured the product's essence without explaining it too literally: spam. The exact derivation remains debated. Spiced ham seems most likely. Shoulder pork and ham remains possible. Special army meat would come later, during the war, as soldiers imposed their own meaning on the acronym. The name's genius lay in its brevity and distinctiveness. Spam sounded modern, technological, American in the way that captured the 1930s fascination with streamlined efficiency and scientific progress. Hormel launched Spam in 1937 with an advertising campaign that emphasized convenience, economy, and versatility. Newspaper ads showed housewives serving Spam to appreciative families, slicing it for sandwiches, frying it for breakfast, incorporating it into casseroles. The message was clear. Spam wasn't emergency food or a cheap substitute for a real meat. It was a modern solution to the ancient problem of keeping protein in the pantry. The product succeeded immediately, though not spectacularly. Depression-era American families appreciated inexpensive protein that didn't spoil. Grocers liked products that didn't require refrigeration and had long shelf lives, reducing waste and inventory management costs. Within 2 years, Spam had become a modest but reliable seller, generating steady profits without revolutionizing American eating habits or the Hormel Company's business model. Then, global events intervened in ways that would transform this unremarkable commercial success into a strategic military asset. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, beginning the European phase of World War II. By June 1940, France had fallen, and Britain faced Germany alone, dependent on Atlantic convoys for survival. The United States, officially neutral but increasingly sympathetic to Britain's plight, began expanding aid under the Lend-Lease program that would eventually provide over $50 billion in military equipment, raw materials, and food to Allied nations. The logistics of feeding Britain presented problems that seemed insoluble using traditional approaches. Fresh meat required refrigerated ships, a scarce and vulnerable resource given German U-boat operations. Frozen meat required constant refrigeration during Atlantic crossings that could take 2 weeks or more, then refrigerated storage in Britain and distribution to consumers. Any interruption in this cold chain resulted in spoilage and waste. Britain needed protein that could survive torpedo attacks that might disable a ship's refrigeration, that could sit in damaged warehouses until distribution resumed, that required minimal preparation in homes where gas and electricity were frequently interrupted by bombing. Spam solved all these problems simultaneously. It required no refrigeration during shipping, allowing convoy organizers to fill available cargo space without worrying about refrigeration capacity. It was packed in sturdy metal cans that protected contents from water damage if ships were hit but didn't sink immediately. It had a shelf life measured in years rather than weeks, allowing stockpiling that smoothed out supply disruptions caused by convoy schedules and enemy action. It required no preparation beyond opening the can, critical for civilians coping with rationing, blackouts, and bomb damage that disrupted normal cooking. Most importantly, it provided protein, fat, and calories in a stable package that the British government could distribute through existing ration systems. The Lend-Lease food shipments to Britain began in 1941, and Spam quickly became a substantial component. Hormel ramped up production dramatically, from approximately 18 million cans in 1940 to over 100 million cans by 1942. The Austin, Minnesota plant operated around the clock, with workers on 3 shifts keeping production lines running continuously. The company hired women in unprecedented numbers to replace men who'd entered military service, transforming a male-dominated industrial workforce into one where women performed every job from butchering to can seaming. The scale of production represented a fundamental shift in American industrial capacity. Before the war, Hormel had produced food for American consumers in quantities measured by trainloads. During the war, production scaled to quantities measured by the shipload, filling entire Liberty ships with nothing but canned meat destined for Britain, Russia, and eventually American forces deployed worldwide. But even as Hormel's Austin plant worked at maximum capacity, German propaganda found in Spam a perfect target for ridicule. German radio broadcasts monitoring Allied communications intercepted messages about Spam shipments and incorporated them into propaganda aimed at demoralizing American and British soldiers. The broadcasts, delivered in English by Lord Haw Haw and other German propagandists, mocked the canned meat as evidence of American cultural inferiority and industrial desperation. Real armies, the broadcasts suggested, ate fresh food prepared by skilled cooks. Real military logistics delivered hot meals to troops in the field. Only an army as culturally backwards and industrially incompetent as America's would feed its soldiers gelatinous meat extruded from a can, meat so processed and artificial that it barely qualified as food. The mockery found receptive audiences among German soldiers who took genuine pride in their field rations. The Wehrmacht's food system had been designed by nutritionists and quartermaster officers who understood that soldier morale depended significantly on food quality. German troops in combat zones received rations calculated to provide 3,000 to 3,500 calories per day, heavy on bread, potatoes, and meat from the mobile field kitchens that followed units into combat. The Gulasch Kanone, literally goulash cannon, was a mobile cooking unit that could prepare hot meals for an entire company while moving, featuring actual ovens for baking bread and equipment for brewing real coffee. German soldiers considered the Gulasch Kanone the heart of company operations, more important for morale than any weapon. The contrast with American rations seemed to validate German assumptions about the superiority of their military culture and the decadence of American society. Where Germans ate fresh-baked bread and goulash prepared by trained cooks, Americans ate canned mystery meat. Where German logistics prioritized quality and morale, American logistics prioritized convenience and mass production. The comparisons seem to demonstrate that Germany's military excellence would prevail over American industrial quantity, that spirit and culture mattered more than factories and tin cans. This narrative would prove catastrophically wrong, but understanding why requires examining the material reality of food logistics in modern industrial warfare on a scale that exceeded anything in previous human history. The Wehrmacht's food logistics system that German soldiers considered superior to American rations had been designed around assumptions that proved catastrophically flawed when tested against the reality of sustained multi-front warfare. German military planners, drawing on experience from World War I and influenced by the nation's agricultural limitations, had created a supply system that worked brilliantly for short, decisive campaigns. It failed spectacularly when campaigns extended beyond their planned duration and supply lines stretched across conquered territories that couldn't feed occupying armies. The German ration system operated on 4 tiers, Verpflegungssatz 1 through 4, each calibrated to provide different caloric levels based on duty assignment. Verpflegungssatz 1, for troops committed to combat, provided approximately 3,200 calories daily, consisting of 750 grams of bread, 120 grams of meat, 1,000 grams of potatoes, and substantial quantities of fat, vegetables, and coffee. This was genuinely excellent nutrition by wartime standards, more generous than British or even American garrison rations for equivalent personnel. The Gulasch Kanone that delivered these rations was a technological achievement in its own right. The mobile field kitchen featured a firebox that burned wood or coal, multiple cooking surfaces for simultaneous preparation of several dishes, an oven capable of baking bread in the field, and equipment for brewing coffee. Experienced cooks assigned to each unit prepared meals that approached restaurant quality under field conditions. German soldiers took immense pride in their field kitchens, viewing them as symbols of German organizational excellence and cultural superiority. But this system contained fatal weaknesses that German planners had never adequately addressed. The rations depended entirely on continuous supply from rear areas. The Gulasch Kanone carried enough food for perhaps 2 meals for a company of 150 men. After that, fresh supplies had to arrive daily, requiring functioning transportation networks, adequate fuel for trucks, and secure routes from supply depots to forward positions. When any element of this chain broke down, soldiers immediately faced reduced rations or complete supply failure. The Eisern ration, the emergency iron ration that every soldier carried, provided minimal sustenance during supply disruptions. The full version contained 250 grams of hard biscuits, 200 grams of canned meat, 150 grams of preserved vegetables, and coffee. It was designed as a one-day emergency supply to bridge temporary gaps until regular supply resumed. Soldiers were forbidden from consuming it without explicit orders from officers on penalty of disciplinary action. The half-iron ration, just biscuits and canned meat, was the version most commonly carried in soldiers' packs. These rations were adequate for short disruptions of 24 to 48 hours. They were catastrophically inadequate when supply lines collapsed for days or weeks, which happened with increasing frequency as the war progressed, and Allied forces systematically destroyed German transportation infrastructure. German soldiers on the Eastern Front learned to supplement rations through foraging, confiscating food from civilians in occupied territories. This wasn't merely opportunistic theft. It was explicit German policy, codified in plans like the Hunger Plan that deliberately diverted food from conquered populations to feed German troops and German civilians. Millions of Soviet citizens starved as German forces requisitioned harvests, livestock, and stored food. This brutal efficiency worked in the East, where German armies controlled vast agricultural regions and faced populations that Nazi ideology deemed expendable. It failed in the West, where territories were smaller, more urbanized, and where political considerations sometimes limited the Wehrmacht's ability to simply steal what it needed. By December 1944, as Klaus Hartmann crouched in his foxhole in the Hürtgen forest, surviving on expired iron rations, the entire German logistics system had entered terminal collapse. Allied bombing had destroyed railways, bridges, and fuel depots throughout Germany. Fuel shortages meant that even undamaged trucks couldn't deliver supplies. The labor force that loaded supplies onto vehicles and operated field kitchens was depleted by casualties and the desperate mobilization of every able-bodied man for combat duty. The food itself was running out as Germany lost access to occupied territories that had provided agricultural products. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, illustrated these failures with brutal clarity. German planners knew their forces lacked adequate fuel for the operation. The plan explicitly depended on capturing American fuel depots during the advance. When German spearheads failed to capture fuel stocks quickly enough, tank columns ran out of gas and stopped, their crews abandoning perfectly functional vehicles for lack of the gasoline needed to drive them another mile. Food supplies for the offensive were similarly inadequate. German units that advanced rapidly outran their supply lines, then discovered that local Belgian stocks had already been consumed or evacuated. Within days, German soldiers who'd started the offensive with full rations were scrounging for food, eating what they carried, and looking for opportunities to capture American supplies. American supply depots captured during the offensive provided German soldiers with their first direct encounter with the industrial abundance that characterized U.S. logistics. A single American supply dump contained more food than a German division received in a month. The quantities seemed impossible, wasteful, evidence of an industrial capacity so vast it appeared unlimited by any practical constraint. And everywhere among those supplies were cans of Spam, stacked in crates that bore markings in English that German soldiers couldn't read but whose meaning was clear from sheer quantity. This was what abundance looked like when a nation's industrial base could produce food faster than armies could consume it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Austin, Minnesota plant where Spam was produced had transformed during wartime into a factory operating at scales its pre-war designers never imagined. The facility that once produced 18 million cans annually for the civilian market ramped up to produce over 100 million cans by 1942, with production continuing to increase through 1944. The company operated 24 hours daily, with 3 shifts of workers maintaining continuous production. Night shift workers in 1944 were producing food that soldiers would eat in Europe or the Pacific within weeks, the supply chain operating with efficiency that seemed impossible to German logistics officers accustomed to supply timelines measured in months. The production process began with pork shoulder arriving from farms throughout the Midwest. The shoulders were deboned, trimmed of excessive fat, and cut into chunks small enough for grinding equipment. Ham, comprising 10% of the final product, was processed separately to ensure quality. The meat went through industrial grinders that reduced it to a consistent texture, fine enough to process smoothly, but coarse enough to retain some meat character. Sodium nitrite, the preservative that prevented bacterial growth and gave Spam its characteristic pink color, was added at precisely controlled concentrations. Too little and the product would spoil. Too much and it became unsafe for consumption. Salt, sugar, and potato starch went into mixing drums along with the ground meat, creating batches measured in thousands of pounds. The mixture was extruded through filling machines directly into cans that moved past on conveyor belts at speeds approaching 100 cans per minute. The cans, manufactured from tin-plated steel at mills throughout the Midwest, arrived at the plant in quantities measured by the trainload. Each can was filled to within a quarter-inch of the top, leaving space for the vacuum sealing process that would follow. Lids were crimped onto filled cans by seaming machines that created hermetically sealed containers. The sealed cans moved into pressure retorts, massive steam pressure cookers that held thousands of cans. Steam heated to 260 degrees Fahrenheit under 15 pounds of pressure per square inch filled the retorts, cooking the meat thoroughly while simultaneously sterilizing the contents. The cooking process took 90 minutes, during which internal temperature reached levels that killed all bacterial spores, including those of Clostridium botulinum, the organism that causes lethal botulism poisoning in improperly canned foods. After cooking, the retorts were vented and cooled gradually to prevent the cans from buckling. The cooling meat released gelatin that filled voids in the can, creating the solid block that would slide out cleanly when the can was opened. Quality control personnel sampled cans from each batch, examining color, texture, and taste to ensure consistency. Cans that passed inspection were labeled, packed into wooden crates containing 48 cans each, and shipped within days to military depots or directly to ports for overseas shipment. The scale of this operation dwarfed anything in German food production. The Austin plant alone produced more canned meat than Germany's entire military canning industry. Hormel wasn't even the only American company producing canned meat for military use. The Army Quartermaster Corps contracted with dozens of meat processors, buying 60 different varieties of canned meat by war's end. Spam became the generic name soldiers applied to all canned meat rations, but the actual procurement included products from multiple manufacturers, each producing millions of cans. The industrial infrastructure supporting this production operated on a scale Germany couldn't match. Tin for the cans came from smelters processing ore imported from Bolivia and Southeast Asia, transported across oceans by cargo ships that faced U-boat attacks but kept delivering material anyway. Steel for can bodies came from mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio that produced more steel than Germany's entire Ruhr industrial region. The meat came from farms throughout the Midwest, where farmers raised hogs on feed produced by American agriculture, which was so productive it fed the entire U.S. population, while simultaneously exporting millions of tons of food to allies. The trucks that transported cans from Austin to distribution centers came from assembly lines in Detroit that produced more vehicles in a month than German factories built in a year. The labels on the cans used ink from chemical plants and paper from mills, each industry operating at full capacity while simultaneously supporting war production in dozens of other sectors. This was America's industrial strength expressed not in tanks or aircraft, but in the unglamorous logistics of feeding millions of men scattered across 3 continents and 2 oceans. American military ration planning reflected assumptions fundamentally different from German approaches. Where German planners emphasized quality and morale value of food, American planners emphasized reliability, simplicity, and abundance. The K-ration, developed in 1941 by physiologist Ansel Keys, provided approximately 3,000 calories in 3 boxed meals that weighed just over 2 pounds total. Each meal included canned meat, biscuits, powdered coffee, sugar, cigarettes, and gum, packaged in waxed cardboard boxes that protected contents adequately in most conditions. The K-ration was never intended as a long-term solution. Keys designed it as a 3 to 5 day emergency ration for troops cut off from regular supply. The Quartermaster Corps adopted it as a standard field ration, issuing it for weeks or months to soldiers in combat. Soldiers hated it, complaining about monotony, inadequate caloric content for sustained combat operations, and the uninspiring taste of mechanically deboned chicken or pork loaf. But K-rations worked in situations where German logistics failed completely. They didn't require refrigeration or cooking. They were light enough for soldiers to carry several days' supply without excessive weight. They had shelf lives measured in years, allowing pre-positioning of stocks near expected combat zones. Most importantly, American industry could produce them in quantities sufficient to feed entire armies without strain. By 1944, monthly K-ration production exceeded 5 million units, each unit containing 3 meals. American forces consumed over 150 million K-rations during the war, distributed globally with the same efficiency that characterized American logistics generally. The C-ration, developed earlier but continuously refined, provided canned meals in larger portions than K-rations. Each C-ration contained 1 M unit with meat and beans or meat and vegetable stew, and 1 B unit with bread, dessert, and accessories. Total weight approached 2 pounds per ration, heavier than K-rations, but providing more substantial meals that soldiers found less monotonous. C-rations became the standard field ration for units in sustained combat, where regular hot meals couldn't be guaranteed, but weight wasn't as critical as for airborne or highly mobile forces. The variety available in C-rations expanded throughout the war as the Quartermaster Corps responded to soldier feedback and incorporated new products. By 1945, C-ration menus included 10 different meat combinations, from ham and lima beans, universally despised, to beef stew, generally considered acceptable. The A ration, fresh food prepared in field kitchens, and B ration, packaged unprepared food for kitchen preparation, rounded out the ration system for units in garrison or relatively stable positions. German soldiers who captured American supplies during the Bulge Offensive discovered that even the maligned K and C rations contained more food than their own iron rations and tasted considerably better than week-old bread and questionable canned meat that had been stored improperly. More significantly, captured German soldiers receiving American rations as prisoners discovered they were eating better as prisoners than they had as combat soldiers for months. This wasn't propaganda or psychological warfare. It was the simple material fact that American logistics could feed prisoners of war adequately while simultaneously feeding millions of American soldiers, Allied forces, and civilian populations in liberated territories. The contrast between German and American food logistics illustrated a broader strategic reality that German military leadership had failed to grasp when planning for prolonged war. Germany had designed its military around the assumption of short, decisive campaigns that would end before logistics became critical. The Wehrmacht excelled at tactical operations, the movement and employment of forces in battle. It struggled with operational logistics, the sustained movement and supply of forces over time and distance. America approached warfare differently, building logistics systems first and designing operations around what logistics could support. This seemed inefficient, wasteful, even cowardly to German officers trained to value tactical excellence and aggressive action. But when wars lasted years rather than months and extended across continents, the side with superior logistics won regardless of tactical excellence. The production of 150 million pounds of Spam during the war represented just one component of American food logistics. Total military food procurement during the war exceeded $10 billion. Approximately $140 billion in 2025 terms. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. United States produced enough food to feed its own military, approximately 12 million men by 1945, plus substantial Allied forces through Lend-Lease programs. Britain received over 20 million tons of food through Lend-Lease. The Soviet Union received over 4.5 million tons. The quantities defied German assumptions about what was logistically possible during global war. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, serving as a political commissar with frontline Soviet forces during the war, would later write in his autobiography that without Spam, the Soviet Union wouldn't have been able to feed its army. This was not hyperbole. Soviet agriculture had been devastated by German invasion, with the Wehrmacht deliberately destroying crops, slaughtering livestock, and burning villages as part of systematic starvation policy. American food shipments through dangerous Arctic convoys to Murmansk and through Persian Gulf routes to Iran kept Soviet soldiers fed while Soviet industry focused on producing tanks and artillery. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, a teenager working in her parents' grocery during the war, later recalled spam as a wartime delicacy, the protein source that made Christmas dinner possible in 1943 when traditional meat was unobtainable. British civilians facing strict rationing received spam through government distribution networks, each representing a meal that replaced meat that simply didn't exist within Britain's besieged agricultural system. The American soldiers guarding Klaus Hartmann and thousands of other German prisoners in the days following their capture faced logistical challenges of their own. The Quartermaster Corps had planned for prisoner rations based on Geneva Convention requirements that prisoners of war receive the same food as the capturing nation's troops. By late December 1944, American forces in Europe were processing German prisoners at rates that strained supply systems already stretched by rapid advances and winter weather that complicated transportation. The solution was pragmatic and revealing. German prisoners received American K and C rations, the same food American soldiers consumed in the field. For men like Hartmann, who'd spent months on deteriorating German rations followed by days surviving on iron rations, the American food represented abundance almost impossible to comprehend. A single American K ration provided more calories than his last 3 days of German iron rations combined. The C ration cans contained actual meat in quantities he hadn't seen since the early days of the war. The cigarettes included in every ration were premium American tobacco, not the ersatz mixtures German soldiers had been receiving. Even the packaging seemed extravagant, waxed cardboard that protected contents perfectly compared to the deteriorating paper and tin plate that characterized late-war German packaging. The psychological impact of this discovery rippled through prisoner-of-war camps as captured German soldiers compared notes. They were eating better as prisoners than they had as combat soldiers. The food wasn't even particularly good by American standards. Soldiers on both sides complained about K and C rations. But compared to the starvation rations that had characterized the final year of the German war effort, American field rations seemed luxurious. The comparison became even more stark when Red Cross parcels began reaching camps. These parcels, assembled by the American Red Cross and shipped through neutral Switzerland, supplemented basic rations with additional food. A standard American Red Cross parcel contained items that seemed to come from another civilization entirely to German soldiers accustomed to scarcity. 12 ounces of tinned meat, usually spam or similar products, canned milk, butter, cheese and jam, chocolate bars and sugar, coffee, real coffee, made from actual coffee beans rather than the roasted barley and acorn substitutes Germans had been drinking since 1942. Cigarettes, 80 per parcel, more than most German soldiers had received in months. For prisoners who'd experienced the systematic starvation that characterized German food policy in occupied territories, who'd watched German logistics collapse under Allied bombing and partisan attacks, who'd survived on rations that provided barely enough calories to prevent immediate death, these parcels represented an industrial and agricultural capacity that seemed almost supernatural. How could a nation simultaneously feed its own massive military, equip and feed Allied armies, supply civilian populations in liberated territories, and provide luxuries like chocolate and cigarettes to enemy prisoners, all while fighting global war on multiple continents? The answer lay in the industrial system that had produced £150 million of spam, a system that treated logistics and abundance as strategic weapons as important as tanks or bombers. The mathematical reality of American food production during World War II defied German assumptions about what was possible under wartime conditions. American agriculture in 1944 produced over 350 million bushels of wheat, enough to provide every American soldier, sailor, airman, and marine with over 6 pounds of bread weekly, while simultaneously exporting millions of tons to allies. Corn production exceeded 3 billion bushels, feeding not just humans but the livestock that provided meat, milk, and eggs. American meat packing plants processed over 23 billion pounds of meat annually during peak war years, supplying military and civilian needs while exporting to allies through Lend-Lease. The livestock industry that supported this production operated at scales that seemed impossible to agricultural planners from other nations. American farmers raised over 50 million hogs annually during the war years, each hog producing approximately 200 pounds of usable meat. Cattle populations exceeded 70 million head, producing beef, milk, and leather simultaneously. This wasn't achieved through German-style conquest and exploitation of occupied territories. It was the product of mechanized agriculture on vast scale, supported by industrial production of farming equipment, chemical fertilizers, and transportation infrastructure that moved agricultural products from farms to processing plants to distribution centers with minimal waste. The Hormel plant in Austin represented just one node in this system, taking raw agricultural products and transforming them into shelf-stable food that could be shipped globally and stored indefinitely. Similar plants operated throughout the Midwest, each producing different products, but all contributing to an aggregate capacity that kept American and Allied forces fed, regardless of where they fought or how far from supply bases they operated. American soldiers fighting in the Pacific received the same rations as those in Europe. Forces in Alaska and North Africa, separated by nearly half the globe, consumed identical sea rations because the supply system simply delivered food wherever it was needed without regard to distance or climate. This logistical achievement depended fundamentally on products like Spam that didn't require refrigeration, that withstood rough handling and extreme temperatures, that provided nutrition in compact, durable packages, the very characteristics that made Spam a target for mockery, its processed nature, its unnatural shelf stability, its industrial uniformity, made it ideal for global logistics supporting multi-million man forces operating across 3 continents and 2 oceans. But American soldiers didn't appreciate these strategic virtues. They experienced Spam the way frontline troops experience everything, as the irritating monotony of yet another meal that tasted the same as yesterday's meal and would taste the same tomorrow. The complaints started early and grew louder as the war progressed. Soldiers wrote letters home, describing Spam with creative vulgarity that demonstrated both American linguistic inventiveness and genuine food fatigue. They consumed it because they had no choice, then complained about it because complaining was the soldier's prerogative. J. Hormel, son of the company founder and president during the war years, found himself receiving what he would later describe as a scurrilous file of letters from servicemen who blamed him personally for their dietary suffering. The letters expressed sentiments ranging from mild complaint to creative threats. Some compared him unfavorably to Hitler and Hirohito, suggesting he'd done more damage to American morale than enemy propaganda. Others proposed cruel and unusual punishments involving forced consumption of Spam, prepared in deliberately unappetizing ways. The creativity soldiers applied to insulting Spam demonstrated the education level and linguistic facility of American forces, but also revealed how thoroughly the product had penetrated military consciousness. Spam had become the universal symbol of military food, loved by no one, despised by many, and consumed by millions because the alternative was hunger. Hormel kept the letters, maintaining his scurrilous file as documentation of how deeply his product had embedded itself in the American military experience. The irony wasn't lost on him. Spam had achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve, keeping millions of men adequately fed under conditions that would have starved armies in previous eras. Soldiers hated it for succeeding too well, for being so reliably available that they could never escape it, for lasting so long that supply officers could stockpile it everywhere without worry about spoilage. The psychological transformation that occurred as American soldiers returned home illustrated another dimension of Spam's impact. Men who'd eaten it daily for years wanted nothing to do with it in civilian life. The sight of those familiar blue and yellow cans in grocery stores triggered memories of cold rations eaten in muddy foxholes, hot rations eaten in tropical jungles, emergency rations eaten during artillery bombardments. Spam had kept them alive, but they associated it with everything unpleasant about military service. This rejection had minimal impact on Hormel's business, because Spam had found enthusiastic acceptance in populations that had experienced wartime scarcity rather than wartime abundance. British civilians who'd survived years of rationing remembered Spam not as monotonous military issue, but as the protein source that made meals possible when British meat production couldn't meet demand. Margaret Thatcher's memory of Boxing Day, 1943 spam and salad, represented this British experience. The meal was special because spam was available, turning a holiday dinner into something celebratory despite rationing constraints. Soviet troops and civilians received spam through Lend-Lease convoys that delivered supplies at tremendous cost in ships and lives to submarine attacks. For Red Army soldiers accustomed to rations that often fell below sustenance levels, American canned meat was luxury rather than monotony. Nikita Khrushchev's assertion that the Soviet Union couldn't have fed its army without spam reflected strategic reality. Soviet agriculture, devastated by German invasion and German implementation of the hunger plan that deliberately starved millions, couldn't produce enough food to feed combat forces. American food shipments, delivered through dangerous Arctic and Persian Gulf routes, provided the protein that kept Soviet soldiers fighting through conditions that killed millions of Soviet civilians. In the Pacific, particularly in areas that had experienced prolonged American military presence, spam became incorporated into local cuisines in ways that no one had anticipated. Hawaii, Guam, Okinawa, and the Philippines had received massive quantities of spam during the war, as American forces staged operations throughout the region. Local populations, facing food shortages caused by war disruption and often dependent on American supplies, discovered that spam was versatile, durable, and more reliable than traditional protein sources that required refrigeration or rapid consumption. After the war, spam remained popular in these regions, becoming integrated into traditional dishes in creative ways that horrified culinary purists but demonstrated the product's genuine utility. In Hawaii, spam musubi, combining spam with rice and nori in a format similar to sushi, became a standard convenience food. In the Philippines, spam appeared in traditional dishes like sinigang and adobo, providing protein that fit existing flavor profiles. In South Korea, where American troops had brought spam during the Korean War, it became incorporated into budae jjigae, army base stew, a dish created from ingredients available near American bases. These adaptations demonstrated that spam's perceived inadequacy was cultural rather than nutritional. American soldiers rejected it because they had alternatives and associated it with hardship. Populations that had experienced genuine food scarcity recognized it as practical protein source that solved real problems of storage, preparation, and availability. The strategic lessons that emerged from spam's wartime role extended far beyond the specific product. Military planners, studying logistics after the war, recognized that industrial food production had become as important to military capability as weapons production. An army that could rely on abundant, shelf-stable rations could operate more aggressively, take greater risks, and sustain operations longer than forces dependent on vulnerable supply chains for fresh food. The contrast between American and German food logistics in the war's final year illustrated this principle with brutal clarity. American forces advancing into Germany in 1945 maintained regular rations, even as they outran supply lines, because K and C rations could be stockpiled anywhere and would remain edible indefinitely. German forces retreating through their own homeland faced starvation because their logistics system had been designed around fresh food prepared in mobile kitchens, and when those kitchens couldn't keep up or ran out of supplies, soldiers simply went hungry. The industrial capacity that produced 150 million pounds of spam during the war also produced the canned vegetables, fruits, milk, butter, and other foods that filled C rations and other military food packages. Each product represented similar engineering challenges, scaling up commercial food processing to meet military demand while maintaining quality and safety. The Quartermaster Corps Food and Container Institute, established to develop and test military rations, worked with commercial food processors to adapt civilian products for military use. The result was a complete logistics system that could feed millions regardless of where they were stationed or how long supply lines stretched. This system didn't emerge spontaneously. It represented deliberate engineering by military planners who understood that logistics won wars as surely as tactics. The investment in developing K rations, C rations, and the industrial infrastructure to produce them paid strategic dividends that exceeded the cost by orders of magnitude. American forces never faced the food shortages that plagued German, Japanese, and even Soviet forces at various points during the war. This freedom from logistical constraint allowed operational flexibility that commanders exploited ruthlessly. The economic implications of wartime food logistics extended into the post-war era in ways that shaped global food systems for decades. The industrial processing techniques developed to produce Spam and other military rations found civilian applications in convenience foods that transformed American eating habits. Frozen foods, instant coffee, and other products that required minimal preparation emerged from wartime necessity and became commercial successes as companies applied military logistics lessons to civilian markets. The global distribution networks established to deliver food to forces worldwide became templates for post-war international trade in agricultural products. American grain exports, dairy products, and processed foods reached global markets using transportation and distribution systems tested during wartime. The agricultural productivity that had fed American and Allied forces during the war continued afterward, transforming the United States into the world's dominant food exporter. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Western Europe after the war included substantial American food aid, leveraging agricultural abundance to support economic recovery while expanding markets for American agricultural products. This wasn't altruism. It was strategic policy that recognized food as an instrument of influence as important as military force or economic investment. The symbolic legacy of Spam transcended its nutritional or strategic importance. In American culture, Spam became shorthand for military experience, particularly the unglamorous logistics and daily irritations that characterized most soldiers' service. Veterans told Spam stories, embellishing the monotony and occasional revulsion into humorous narratives that bonded those who'd shared the experience. The 1970s British comedy troupe Monty Python immortalized Spam in a sketch that used the product's ubiquity as metaphor for inescapable repetition. The sketch, featuring a cafe where every dish contained Spam and customers couldn't escape it regardless of what they ordered, captured both the wartime experience of soldiers who ate it daily and the broader human experience of confronting unavoidable irritation with dark humor. The term Spam, lowercase, eventually migrated to electronic communication as descriptor for unwanted repetitive messages, preserving the original product's association with inescapability and mild annoyance. For Klaus Hartmann and the millions of other German soldiers who experienced American abundance firsthand as prisoners, the lesson was more profound and disturbing. Germany had lost the war not because German soldiers lacked courage or German tactics were inferior or German weapons technology fell short. Germany lost because it had attempted to fight a prolonged industrial war against opponents whose combined industrial capacity exceeded German capacity by factors that made German victory mathematically impossible. The food that American guards distributed to German prisoners, the K rations and C rations and Red Cross parcels that contained Spam and chocolate and real coffee, represented this industrial disparity in its most visceral form. Every meal demonstrated that America could produce more food than Germany, transport it more efficiently, deliver it more reliably, and do so while simultaneously equipping forces with tanks and aircraft and ammunition in quantities that dwarfed German production. The most sophisticated tactical excellence, the most advanced weapons technology, the most aggressive operational planning couldn't overcome this fundamental material imbalance. The German military that had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and pushed deep into the Soviet Union had been designed for short campaigns that would end before industrial capacity became decisive. When the war extended into years and American industry mobilized fully, Germany faced an opponent who could produce more of everything, who could accept higher losses because replacement equipment and trained personnel arrived faster than losses accumulated, who could feed prisoners better than Germany could feed combat troops. The cans of Spam that German prisoners opened in POW camps, eating American rations that exceeded their pre-capture diet, served as daily reminders of this reality. They ate better as defeated prisoners than they had as soldiers fighting for what their leaders had promised would be German dominance of Europe. Each meal reinforced the lesson that industrial wars are won in factories and farms, not just on battlefields. and that victory requires not merely tactical brilliance, but the unglamorous foundation of logistics that keeps armies fed and equipped, regardless of how far from home they fight or how long campaigns extend. The final irony was that German propaganda's mockery of American canned rations had been precisely wrong. Spam wasn't evidence of American cultural inferiority or industrial desperation. It was evidence of industrial capacity so vast that America could waste engineering talent and factory capacity producing shelf-stable protein in quantities sufficient to feed millions. It could dedicate shipping space to products that didn't require the refrigeration that limited cargo capacity, could treat abundance as strategy and make logistics into weapon that proved as decisive as any armament. The Germans who'd laughed at American dependence on canned meat learned through bitter experience that the side which solves logistics wins wars, even if soldiers on both sides complain about the food. 150 million pounds of Spam, produced in Austin, Minnesota, shipped globally, consumed reluctantly by millions, despised by those it sustained, represented America's approach to industrial warfare. Solve problems through abundance rather than scarcity, through engineering rather than suffering, through systematic material superiority rather than tactical excellence alone. This approach lacked the dramatic appeal of blitzkrieg, or the romantic mystique of elite formations, or the technological fascination of advanced weapons. But it worked. It kept armies fed across global distances and sustained operations that would have been impossible with traditional logistics. It demonstrated that modern war required not just combat forces, but the complete industrial infrastructure supporting them, from farms growing food to factories processing it to transportation networks, delivering it to soldiers who complained about it while depending on it absolutely. The story of Spam in World War II isn't about the product itself, which was unremarkable except for its suitability to military logistics. It's about the system that produced it, the industrial capacity that made £150 million seem achievable rather than impossible, the logistical networks that delivered it reliably, the strategic thinking that recognized food as weapon as important as explosives. German soldiers who'd mocked American canned rations discovered this truth through defeat and captivity, learning that the most powerful weapon in modern war isn't any specific technology, but the complete industrial system that produces, equips, supplies, and sustains military forces regardless of where they fight or how long campaigns last. Klaus Hartmann would return to Germany in 1946, repatriated after months as prisoner of war during which he ate better than he had during his final year of military service. He carried with him memories of American abundance that had seemed physically impossible given his experience of German scarcity. The sight of American supply depots stacked with food, the daily rations that provided more than German combat rations, the casual waste that characterized American logistics, where damaged supplies were simply destroyed rather than carefully salvaged, all of it demonstrated an industrial capacity that Germany had never possessed and could never have matched. The war had not been close. It had been inevitable from the moment America's industrial base mobilized fully. Germany could have won tactical victories endlessly without changing the strategic outcome, because strategy rested on industrial mathematics that made German defeat certain once American factories reached full production. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.